In a quiet suburban neighborhood where every lawn was trimmed with meticulous care, a storm was brewing that no one could see coming, at first glance. The neighborhood seemed like a picture-perfect postcard. Rows of modest yet elegant homes stood side by side, their driveways lined with shiny sedans and carefully placed flower beds. The sidewalks were swept, the trees were pruned, and the lawns were evenly cut, creating an almost artificial sense of order. But beneath that order lurked something more volatile, an unwritten hierarchy of pride, ego, and unspoken boundaries. And at the heart of it all lay a strip of grass no wider than a car, a strip that one neighbor had begun to believe was hers. For years, the property line between two adjacent houses had never been questioned. The previous owners maintained their respective halves, mowing, watering, and edging their grass without complaint. There was no fence. Only a clear visual separation where one yard ended and the other began. But everything changed when a new neighbor moved in, a woman known quickly around the block for her sharp tongue and sharper sense of entitlement. She was the type of neighbor who noticed every car parked too long on the street, every recycling bin set out at the wrong hour, and every blade of grass that dared to grow uneven. People whispered her name behind closed doors, often attaching the dreaded label, a Karen. To her, the rules applied selectively, and her opinion carried more weight than any law, ordinance, or county survey. At first, her arrival caused little disturbance beyond a few awkward interactions. She would complain about harmless things like children's chalk drawings on the sidewalk or a trash can not being rolled in quickly enough. Most of the neighbors shrugged her off, tolerating her constant nitpicking as just another quirk of suburban life. But the situation escalated when she turned her attention to the yard next door. It began innocently enough, or at least it seemed so at the time. She approached the edge of the neighboring lawn and began mowing over it, extending her lines well past what was hers. At first, the homeowner thought it might be a mistake, perhaps her mower veering slightly over the invisible line. But the pattern repeated, week after week, until it was undeniable. She wasn't just mowing a few inches into the yard, she was cutting several feet into it, making it appear as though the strip belonged to her. Then came the planting, without permission. She started placing decorative items, small garden gnomes, solar lights, and even a potted bush right in the disputed strip of grass. When asked about it, she brushed off the concern with a wave of her hand, as if the question itself was absurd. According to her, that part of the yard had always belonged to her property. It was a bold claim, one that could easily have been dismissed if not for the persistence with which she enforced it. She began watering the strip daily, trimming it as though it were her pride and joy, and glaring at anyone who suggested otherwise. It wasn't too long before she started telling other neighbors that the yard next door had been encroaching on her space for years, and now she was simply correcting the mistake. The homeowner, bewildered by her audacity, decided to check the property deed. Sure enough, the survey markers confirmed what they had always believed: the strip of grass was theirs. The documents left no room for argument. The boundary line was clear and indisputable. Yet, when confronted with this information, the woman refused to back down. She dismissed the paperwork as outdated and claimed she had spoken with friends at the county who supported her position. But no such friends existed. It was all a bluff. The conflict escalated further when she began to physically alter the strip. She dug small trenches to create what looked like flower bed borders. And in one shocking move, she hammered in wooden stakes as though preparing to install a makeshift fence. The homeowner felt helpless, caught between wanting to keep the peace and not wanting to surrender their land. Every morning, the sight of her additions chipped away at their patience. Other neighbors noticed the feud brewing. Some whispered their sympathy, while others avoided getting involved, fearing the wrath of the woman who seemed to thrive on confrontation. Her behavior was becoming the talk of the street, but no one dared confront her directly. She was the type who never admitted fault, who twisted arguments until they worked in her favor. The final straw came one weekend when the homeowner returned from running errands to find a bold new addition in the disputed area. A freshly planted for sale by owner sign stood proudly in the strip of grass, pointing toward her house. It was an absurd act, one that carried no legal weight, but its symbolism was undeniable. She wasn't just trying to claim the land, she was trying to make a statement that she owned it outright. That was when the homeowner realized this battle could no longer be ignored. This wasn't just about a strip of grass anymore. It was about principle, about refusing to let arrogance rewrite the truth. So, they made a decision. They would take the matter beyond the neighborhood gossip and directly to the county. What began as an annoying overreach had now spiraled into a full-blown property dispute. The homeowner gathered their documents, photographs, and survey maps, preparing to prove once and for all that the land was theirs. What they didn't yet know was that the county's involvement would uncover far more than a simple boundary line, and that their neighbor's arrogance would eventually backfire in ways no one could have predicted. The first steps toward escalation had been taken, and there was no turning back. When the homeowner decided to involve the county, it wasn't out of spite. It was out of necessity. The neighbors' encroachment had reached a level that couldn't be ignored any longer. The wooden stakes were still in the ground, the solar lights blinked mockingly every night, and that ridiculous for sale by owner sign sat there as though daring someone to challenge it. What had once been a quiet strip of grass now looked like the opening move in a suburban war. The homeowner gathered every piece of evidence possible. Property deeds, county maps, photographs of the yard before the neighbor moved in, even screenshots of real estate listings that showed the property boundaries as they had always been. It was tedious work, but it brought a strange sense of relief. For the first time since the conflict began, there was a plan in place. When the call was finally made to the county office, the representative on the other end listened carefully. It wasn't the first time they had heard of such disputes. In fact, boundary disagreements were surprisingly common, but as soon as the details were explained, the mowing, the decorations, the stakes, and the sign, the representative sighed and promised that an inspector would be sent out to take a look. The neighbor, however, was not pleased. News travels quickly in tightly knit neighborhoods. And it wasn't long before she found out about the county's involvement. Instead of being deterred, she doubled down. Her yard work became more aggressive, her actions more deliberate. She spent hours outside tending to the disputed strip, pulling weeds with exaggerated determination, and standing watch like a sentinel to make sure no one touched her land. To the other neighbors, it was becoming a spectacle. Some found amusement in her stubbornness, whispering behind curtains about how far she was willing to go. Others began to feel a growing unease, sensing that the conflict might escalate beyond mere theatrics. The woman's glare, once just an annoyance, now carried a sharper edge. She believed she was right, and nothing, not even official documentation, would convince her otherwise. The inspector arrived on a warm Tuesday morning. A white county truck pulled up, its logo gleaming on the door. And out stepped a man with a clipboard and a calm, measured demeanor. He was used to situations like this, used to tempers flaring and neighbors clashing over inches of dirt. But even he seemed taken aback when he saw the scene, the strip of grass littered with ornaments, staked off as though it were a battleground. He introduced himself, explained why he was there, and began his inspection. Using maps, measurements, and the existing survey markers, he carefully walked the property line. His tape measure stretched across the lawn, his notes filled page after page. And his quiet professionalism contrasted sharply with the neighbor's constant interruptions. She followed him every step of the way, arms crossed, her voice sharp as she insisted that the land belonged to her. She pointed to old trees, to the slope of the ground, even to the way the grass grew as evidence that the strip had always been hers. The inspector listened patiently but made no judgments until the work was complete. Meanwhile, the rightful homeowner stood silently, watching with a mixture of anxiety and relief. For the first time, the matter was being taken out of their hands. It was no longer just their word against hers, it was about facts, measurements, and the law. By the end of the inspection, the conclusion was clear: the disputed strip was not hers. The county's survey aligned perfectly with the homeowner's deed. The stakes, the ornaments, and that ridiculous sign were all sitting squarely on land that she had no legal right to claim. The inspector explained this calmly, showing her the documents and measurements. But instead of backing down, she exploded. Her face turned red, her voice rose to a shrill pitch, and she accused the county of corruption. She claimed the homeowner had bribed the inspector, that the documents were falsified, and that everyone was conspiring against her. The inspector remained professional, writing down her statements without emotion. He informed her that the county's ruling was official, and that any further disputes would need to be taken up in court. He also made it clear that her structures, the stakes, the ornaments, and the sign would need to be removed immediately, or she could face fines for encroachment. It was a crushing blow to her ego. But she didn't show defeat. Instead, she muttered about taking it higher, insisting she knew people in positions of authority who would back her up. Her bravado rang hollow, but her defiance was as strong as ever. The inspector left, his report filed with the county, and for a brief moment, the neighborhood felt a sense of relief. It seemed the matter was finally settled, that the line had been drawn both literally and figuratively. But the neighbor was not finished. In the days that followed, she launched a campaign of resistance. She refused to remove her items from the strip, daring the homeowner or the county to do it themselves. She began leaving notes in the mailbox, scribbled messages accusing the homeowner of harassment and theft. She stood at her window, watching, waiting for any excuse to pounce. Her obsession with the strip had consumed her completely. It was no longer about property or boundaries, it was about pride. To her, admitting defeat would mean admitting weakness. And that was something she could never allow. Meanwhile, the homeowner documented everything. Every note, every photo, every confrontation was carefully logged and saved. They knew that if she refused to comply, the county would eventually take further action. It was only a matter of time. But as the tension mounted, the situation began to draw wider attention. Other neighbors started whispering about calling the homeowners association. Even though it technically wasn't involved in property line disputes, some speculated that she might retaliate in more destructive ways. Others wondered how long it would take before law enforcement had to step in. What had started as a simple yard dispute had now spiraled into something far bigger. The woman's refusal to back down had transformed her from a difficult neighbor into a potential menace. And while the county's ruling had been clear, the battle for peace in the neighborhood was far from over, because in her mind, she hadn't lost. Not yet. The county inspector's ruling should have been the end of it. Most reasonable people, when faced with clear documentation and the authority of local government, would have swallowed their pride and moved on, but not her. To her, the ruling wasn't a conclusion, it was a challenge. In the days that followed, the tension in the neighborhood thickened like storm clouds before a downpour. Every time the homeowner stepped outside, they could feel her eyes on them. The curtains in her front window would shift ever so slightly, and there she was, peering out like a watchful hawk. Her obsession had taken root so deeply that even the smallest actions seemed to set her off. A watering can placed near the strip, a rake leaning too close to the line, these became sparks for her fury. She began to escalate her tactics. What had once been notes left in the mailbox soon evolved into full-blown letters, typed in bold capital letters, filled with accusations and demands. In one, she claimed the county had been bribed. In another, she accused the homeowner of trespassing on her land and threatened to sue for damages. The letters grew increasingly bizarre, referencing supposed conversations with non-existent officials and citing laws that didn't apply. The homeowner, though shaken, remained calm. Every letter was carefully filed away. Every incident was documented with photographs and timestamps. The county had already made its ruling, and the homeowner knew the key to winning this war was patience and persistence. But the neighbor wasn't satisfied with paper battles alone. She began to use her yard as a stage for her defiance. Brightly colored signs appeared on the disputed strip, scrawled with messages like "Stay off my property" and "Trespassers will be prosecuted." She hammered them into the ground with such force that the echoes carried across the block. To anyone passing by, it looked like a protest march condensed into a few feet of grass. The neighbors couldn't help but notice. Some shook their heads, muttering about how ridiculous it had all become. Others began to worry about the safety of the neighborhood. If she was willing to go this far over a strip of grass, what else might she be capable of? Things took an even darker turn one Saturday afternoon. The homeowner returned from the grocery store to find that the disputed strip had been vandalized. The lawn, once neatly trimmed, was now covered in patches of dead grass. Sprayed with some kind of chemical, the homeowner's once pristine yard bore the scars of her determination. It was clear she had crossed a line from passive-aggressive gestures into active destruction. Photographs were taken, evidence was logged, and the county was contacted once again. But she remained unshaken when approached about the damage. She claimed it was the homeowner's fault for neglecting the grass. Insisting she was merely correcting their mistake, the gall of her denial was almost as infuriating as the act itself. Soon after, law enforcement became involved. A county officer was dispatched to speak with her, armed with the inspector's report and the mounting pile of complaints. To the officer's credit, he remained calm and professional, explaining the situation clearly. But she met him with the same fiery defiance she had shown everyone else. From across the street, neighbors gathered to watch the confrontation unfold. They saw her waving her arms, pointing fingers, her voice rising higher and higher. They saw the officer remain steady, issuing warnings and explaining the consequences of non-compliance. And they saw her turn her fury toward the homeowner, shouting accusations that could be heard from several houses away. It was a spectacle, one that solidified her reputation in the neighborhood. No longer was she just a difficult neighbor, she had become infamous, the subject of hushed conversations and disapproving stares. Parents warned their children to stay away from her yard. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid passing in front of her house. She had become a pariah. And yet she didn't seem to care. Instead, she embraced her role as the self-appointed victim. She began telling anyone who would listen that she was being harassed, that the county was corrupt, and that the entire neighborhood had turned against her out of jealousy. In her mind, she was the hero of the story, fighting against a tide of injustice. But her refusal to comply carried consequences. The county issued her a written notice, demanding the immediate removal of her signs, stakes, and ornaments. She was given a deadline, and the warning was clear: failure to act would result in fines and further legal action. The deadline came and went, and still, nothing changed. Her signs stood defiantly, her ornaments remained, and her presence grew even more hostile. True to their word, the county followed through. A formal citation was issued, complete with fines that would only increase the longer she refused to comply. The homeowner, though frustrated by the slow pace of justice, found a measure of comfort in the process. Each step brought them closer to resolution. Closer to reclaiming not just their yard but their peace of mind. But the battle had taken its toll. Every day felt like walking through a minefield, never knowing what new stunt she might pull. The neighborhood, too, was on edge. Where once children had played freely on the sidewalks and neighbors had chatted casually over fences, now there was tension in the air. People avoided gatherings, conversations were hushed, and a sense of unease settled over the block. And yet, through it all, she remained unrelenting. To her, the county's fines were nothing but an inconvenience. She saw them not as punishment but as proof that the system was against her. Her paranoia grew, her claims became wilder, and her actions more desperate. The homeowner couldn't shake the feeling that things were heading toward a breaking point. County had drawn its line, the law had spoken, but she refused to listen. It was only a matter of time before the situation escalated into something even bigger, something that would draw in more than just county officials. The strip of grass had become a symbol, a battleground for pride, and she was willing to go down fighting. The question now wasn't whether she would comply, it was how far she would go before being forced to stop. The county's citation was supposed to be the final warning. For most people, the threat of mounting fines and official records would have been enough to force compliance, but she wasn't most people. To her, the fines weren't punishment, they were fuel. Every new notice taped to her door only deepened her conviction that she was fighting some grand conspiracy. Within days of receiving the citation, she began to frame herself as a martyr. Her front yard became a stage for her imagined persecution. The signs grew larger, more aggressive. Painted in bold strokes of red and black, They shouted messages like property rights violated and stop the county corruption. She wasn't just claiming a strip of grass anymore, she was declaring war on the very system that had told her she was wrong. Neighbors couldn't believe what they were seeing. The once peaceful street now looked like the front lines of a protest. Cars slowed down as they passed, some drivers shaking their heads, others pulling out their phones to snap photos. Her house became an unintentional landmark, a bizarre attraction that symbolized suburban chaos at its peak, but her defiance carried consequences that she could no longer ignore. The fines began to accumulate quickly. Each week that passed without compliance added to her growing debt. The county didn't just issue empty threats, they followed through. And the numbers on her statements grew higher and higher. For the rightful homeowner, the process was exhausting but validating. Every notice she ignored, every dollar added to her fines, it was proof that the law was on their side. They documented it all, keeping meticulous records in case the dispute escalated to court. Yet even with the law working in their favor, there was little comfort in living next to the chaos she created. The situation came to a head one afternoon when county workers arrived with official orders to remove her stakes, ornaments, and signs. A small team pulled up in a truck, armed with paperwork and tools, ready to clear the disputed strip once and for all. The neighborhood gathered to watch. It wasn't every day that county enforcement showed up in full force, and curiosity got the better of nearly everyone. Parents stood at the edges of their driveways, children peeked from behind fences, and phones were raised to capture the moment. She, of course, did not go quietly. As soon as the workers stepped onto the disputed strip, she stormed out of her house, her voice carrying across the block like a siren. She screamed about trespassing, corruption, theft, and betrayal. She waved her arms wildly, blocking the workers, daring them to touch anything. The workers, calm but firm, showed her the paperwork. The county's ruling was final, and they were authorized to act. When she refused to move, a deputy was called to the scene. His presence shifted the atmosphere immediately. What had been a spectacle turned into something heavier, a moment where everyone realized just how far she had fallen into her delusion. The deputy explained her options: step aside peacefully, or face arrest for obstruction. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see which path she would choose. For a long, tense moment, it seemed she might comply. Her shoulders slumped, her voice wavered, and the fire in her eyes dimmed. But then, just as quickly, the defiance returned. She stood her ground, planting herself in the strip as though her sheer will could alter the truth. The deputy gave her one last chance. When she refused, he moved in. The arrest wasn't dramatic, no handcuffs slammed shut in anger, no shouting match beyond what she had already caused. It was procedural, calm, and efficient, but to the neighborhood, it was monumental. The woman who had terrorized them with her arrogance was finally being held accountable. As she was escorted to the patrol car, her voice carried one last desperate declaration that this wasn't over. With her removed from the scene, the county workers moved quickly. The signs were pulled up, the stakes yanked out, the ornaments removed. In less than an hour, the disputed strip was bare again, restored to the quiet simplicity it had known for years. The homeowner felt a wave of relief wash over them. For the first time in months, the strip looked normal. The battle had left scars. The grass was patchy, the soil uneven, but it was theirs, and it was free from her grasp. Yet even as the county truck drove away and the crowd dispersed, a lingering unease remained. She had been taken away, yes, but everyone knew she would return. And when she did, her anger would not be diminished. If anything, it would burn hotter than ever. Sure enough, just a few days later, she was back. The arrest hadn't broken her spirit, it had solidified her resolve. She returned with a new narrative, telling anyone who would listen that she had been wrongfully imprisoned, that she was the victim of a corrupt system and vindictive neighbors. Her story grew with every retelling, each version more dramatic than the last. The fines continued to mount. Her reputation continued to crumble, and yet she pressed on. The yard was bare now, stripped of her stakes and signs, but her war was far from over. She began filing complaints against the homeowner, flooding local offices with accusations and demands. Each complaint was investigated and dismissed. But the constant harassment wore down everyone involved. The neighborhood, once united in their disdain for her antics, began to feel the weight of her persistence. Conversations turned from laughter at her absurdity to concern about her instability. People wondered what she might do next, what lengths she might go to in order to reclaim the ground she had lost. And deep down, the homeowner couldn't shake the feeling that this battle was building towards something bigger. The county had stepped in, the law had spoken, but she still wasn't done. She was too proud, too stubborn, too determined to let go. The strip of grass had started it all, but now it was about something much larger. It was about control, about defiance. About one woman's refusal to accept reality, and as her desperation grew, so too did the sense that the worst was yet to come. Her arrest should have been the turning point. To any rational person, the sight of county workers tearing down her signs and pulling up her stakes while she sat in the back of a patrol car would have been the final straw. But to her, it was proof of her righteousness. In her mind, she had suffered for the truth, and that made her not a troublemaker, but a crusader. She returned to the neighborhood more unhinged than ever. The moment she was back, she began staging small displays in her yard, symbols of defiance against both the county and her neighbors. Flags appeared overnight, not national flags or neighborhood banners, but strange, hand-painted sheets scrawled with slogans that made little sense. Freedom from fraud read one. Another screamed, "My land, my rules." It wasn't long before her antics escalated from harmless theatrics to disruptive acts that rattled the peace of the entire block. She installed blinding floodlights along her house, pointing them outward so they blazed into the windows of the homeowner next door. Every night, the beams cut through curtains and blinds, making restful sleep nearly impossible. When complaints were raised, she shrugged it off as security measures. Then came the noise. Speakers were placed in her windows, blasting patriotic music and random recordings at all hours of the day and night. Sometimes it was anthems played on repeat, other times it was just her shouting into a microphone, ranting about corruption, property rights, and conspiracies. She had turned her home into a fortress of chaos, one that echoed through the neighborhood. The county was contacted again and again. Officials documented her behavior. Noise complaints were filed, light violations noted, and additional fines stacked against her, but none of it seemed to matter. She refused to pay, refused to comply, and refused to accept the reality everyone else lived in, for the homeowner next door. The toll was immense. What had begun as a simple boundary dispute had now consumed their daily life. The yard they had once taken pride in became a constant reminder of the nightmare they were forced to endure. Every trip outside felt like a confrontation waiting to happen. Every letter from the county felt like another chapter in a battle with no end. The rest of the neighborhood was suffering too. The once friendly block had become a tense, divided community. Some neighbors avoided the area altogether, parking their cars on side streets just to stay out of range of her glares. Others whispered about moving away, unwilling to live under the shadow of her antics any longer. The laughter and barbecues that had once filled the street were replaced by silence and suspicion. It was clear to everyone that she was spiraling, but no one knew where her spiral would end. One evening, the situation escalated in a way no one had expected. The homeowner arrived home to find her outside, spray painting the disputed strip. Large, jagged letters covered the grass and the pavement beside it. Stolen land. Her hands moved furiously, her breathing ragged, her entire body shaking with rage. The homeowner immediately began filming, documenting the vandalism as further evidence. When she noticed, she didn't stop. Instead, she screamed louder, her voice carrying through the twilight air. The neighborhood lights flicked on one by one as doors cracked open and faces appeared at windows. It was a scene of chaos, illuminated by porch lights and the glow of cell phone cameras. Law enforcement was called once again. This time, when the officers arrived, her behavior was more erratic than ever. She paced back and forth, gesturing wildly, her words tumbling out in half-coherent rants about justice and betrayal. The spray paint dripped down the pavement, a neon scar that marked her defiance. The officers tried to reason with her, to calm her down, but she wouldn't listen. Every word they spoke only seemed to inflame her further. Eventually, they issued her another citation, this one carrying harsher penalties, and warned her that further escalation could result in more serious charges. But even as the officers drove away, she remained on her lawn, shouting into the night as though the entire world had conspired against her. The homeowner, exhausted and drained, began to realize something unsettling. This wasn't just about property anymore. It wasn't even about fines or county rulings. This had become about her identity, her pride, her inability to admit defeat, and that made her unpredictable. The county officials, too, began to recognize the seriousness of the situation. Her mounting fines were no longer just financial penalties, they were signals of her refusal to cooperate with any authority. Quiet conversations began to take place behind the scenes about stronger measures that could bring the situation to a definitive close. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had reached its breaking point, where once people had watched her antics with amusement or irritation, now they watched with fear. Parents no longer let their children play outside near her house. Elderly residents whispered about calling lawyers. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before something irreversible happened. And yet, through it all, she carried herself with the conviction of someone who believed she was winning. Her signs, her spray paint, her lights, her noise, they were her weapons. And she wielded them with reckless abandon. But the truth was unavoidable. The county was preparing to step in again. This time, their actions would be stronger, their measures more permanent, and when they did, the facade she had built would finally begin to crumble. The question wasn't if the end was coming, it was when. The street had lived in tension for so long that peace began to feel like a distant memory. The blinding lights, the booming music, the spray-painted pavement, all of it lingered like scars across the neighborhood. Each day was a fresh reminder that one person's stubborn pride had the power to hold an entire block hostage. But beneath the surface chaos, something was shifting. The county had been patient, issuing warnings and fines, hoping compliance would eventually follow. When that didn't work, they escalated with citations and enforcement actions. And now, with her defiance escalating into vandalism and harassment, they were left with no choice but to take decisive action. For the homeowner, the news came in the form of a letter. It was short and formal, but the message was clear. The county was moving forward with legal proceedings. The neighbor was being taken to court, not just for trespassing and harassment, but for non-payment of fines, destruction of property, and obstruction of enforcement. It wasn't a warning this time. It was the beginning of the end. The court date was set, and the neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. Some saw it as justice finally being served. Others worried about what she might do in the meantime, fearful of the storm that might erupt before the gavel fell. She, of course, reacted in predictable fashion. The day after the notice arrived, she stood in her driveway, waving the papers in the air like a battle flag. She shouted to anyone within earshot about how the system was rigged, how the county was corrupt, how the judge would see the truth once and for all. Her voice was hoarse from rage, her face twisted with defiance. To her, the court wasn't the end of the fight, it was just another battlefield. But the walls were closing in. As the date approached, her antics grew wilder, almost desperate. She painted new signs, scrawling threats about justice and revenge. She blasted recordings late into the night, demanding sympathy that never came. Her neighbors no longer watched from behind curtains, they shut their blinds entirely. Weary of her theatrics, the spectacle had lost its entertainment value. Now it was just exhausting. When the day of court finally arrived, she appeared dressed not with humility, but with a strange bravado. She carried binders stuffed with papers, most of them irrelevant printouts from websites and self-written declarations. She strutted into the courtroom as though she were about to win a grand victory. But reality doesn't bend to pride. The county presented its case with precision. Photographs of the disputed strip, records of inspections, copies of every fine, every citation, every official warning. Witness statements from neighbors who had endured her antics, videos showing her vandalism and harassment. It was all laid bare, an unshakable wall of evidence. When her turn came, she launched into the same tirade she had unleashed on her neighbors for months. She accused the county of conspiracy, the homeowner of theft, the inspectors of bribery. She pointed at maps that didn't align, quoted laws that didn't apply, and waved her papers as if sheer volume could drown out the truth. The judge listened patiently but firmly. When her outbursts became too disruptive, she was warned to control herself. But nothing could save her from the reality laid out before the court. The ruling was swift and absolute. The disputed strip was confirmed to belong to the homeowner. Beyond any question, she was ordered to pay the full amount of her accumulated fines, along with restitution for the vandalism she had caused. She was forbidden from harassing or trespassing on her neighbor's property ever again. Under penalty of arrest, the words landed like a gavel striking not just the bench, but her pride. For a moment, she stood frozen, her face pale, her body stiff. The courtroom was silent, waiting to see if she would erupt once again. But she didn't. She gathered her binders with trembling hands, muttering under her breath, and left without another word. The neighborhood felt the change almost immediately. The signs came down, the lights went dark, the speakers fell silent. It was as if the storm that had raged for months had finally burned itself out. Slowly, cautiously, life returned to normal. Children played outside again. Neighbors greeted each other without glancing nervously at her house. The air felt lighter, as though a weight had finally lifted. The homeowner, standing on their lawn and looking at the once disputed strip of grass, felt a wave of relief wash over them. It wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about reclaiming peace, about proving that stubborn pride couldn't erase the truth. The strip of grass looked ordinary again, unremarkable in its simplicity, but to the homeowner, it symbolized victory, the quiet, steady triumph of patience and persistence over chaos and arrogance. As for her, she faded into silence. The fines crippled her financially, the restrictions limited her actions, and the judgment crushed the last fragments of her campaign. She still lived in the house, but she was no longer the loud, disruptive force she had once been. Curtains stayed closed, the yard untended, her presence barely noticeable. The story of the neighbor who tried to claim someone else's yard became a tale told in hushed voices at block parties and neighborhood gatherings, a reminder of how fragile peace can be, and how one person's ego can ignite a fire that consumes an entire street. But it also became a story of justice, of how the truth backed by patience, evidence, and persistence can prevail even against the loudest voice of defiance. In the end, the county had stepped in. The law had spoken, and the neighborhood had reclaimed its peace, and the strip of grass, humble and quiet, finally belonged to the person who had cared for it all along.